present our speaker today. He's an international leader in the field of thinking skills development, critical reflection, and 21st century learning, and maybe best known as the developer of the Thinking Maps model. Currently, he's co-director of Thinking Schools International Consulting Group, Designs for Thinking Consulting Group, and founder of Thinking Foundation. Today's lecture draws on thinking models that have at their core the intent to promote student-centered fluency and automaticity rather than teacher-centered instruction. For that aim, 3 integrated dimensions of thinking will be addressed, including cognitive processes, inquiry methods, and dispositions, explaining how they interact and overlap. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming David Hyerle.
Thank you. Thank you. Buenas tardes. Is on? Hora de siesta? No. Thank you so much for the invitation to come and be with you today. And I'm going to start off with you talking with each other. This morning, Art Costa did a very good job with almost 2,000 people having student-centered learning. And I do want to say that I've benefited from Art Costa. He came into my classroom 35 years ago when I just began teaching in 1980, 1981. And he came in and started talking with me and my colleagues about the idea of directly facilitating thinking for every child. So I've had the mentorship of Art Costa and also David Perkins. So I feel very fortunate to be standing here and being with you this afternoon. So the first thing I would like to have you engage in is asking your partner right next to you, what does it mean to have student-centered thinking? What do you think that means, those words, student-centered thinking? So just take a moment. What is this? Okay, just another moment, please. One of the first things I learned from Art Costa 35 years ago was when you ask students or anybody to have a conversation with each other, you don't say, okay, stop. Remember, sometimes we want to move on too quickly. So the idea is always, I always learn from Art is just say, take another moment and finish your thought. And it's respecting every student's abilities to think and think together. So this idea of student-centered thinking, I want to enter this idea by way of a story about my son, who's now 21 years old. And I had these expectations that he was going to graduate from secondary school and go straight into college. And he said, oh, no. He said, I want to become a chef. I said, I love to eat, so this is good. And I remember it was about a year ago that my son came home and he says, I want to cook for you. And my heart was just, oh. And what does he do? He pulls out this soft, very soft cloth, and he unrolls it, and he has a set of 5 or 6, I think it was 6 knives. Each of them different, but used together. And I realized at that moment he was doing what I was trying to do in schools, and our organization tries to do in schools, is to focus on the students becoming expert in the tools, or dispositions, or cognitive processes, or inquiry. And so often, and at this conference, we hear, if teachers did this, if teachers did, this, and if we use these techniques, we're going to improve our students' abilities to think. So what I want to do is work with you a little bit this afternoon on shifting this, and what if we actually focused on students becoming very fluent with these tools and dispositions. And that was the focus. Now, teachers would, of course, introduce these tools to students, but what would it look like if students were very fluent with them? And that's where I want to go this afternoon. I'd like to just spend a little bit of time just talking about the context of where we are now in education internationally. So one thing that I think still remains, by the way, how many of you follow football? A few? It's soccer in the United States, but football. Have you ever seen a playing field like this? No? Would you like to be on the downside of that pitch? Right? That would be a little bit difficult. Sometimes we have problems with referees, right, and umpires. But really what happens is, in a lot of classrooms around the world, there are many students that start off and the playing field, the pitch, is against them for many different reasons. And I've worked in many schools in New York City. I've worked in Ethiopia. I've worked in Malaysia, Thailand. There are many different places that we're working, and we see that many classrooms, many schools, and many whole systems really don't have the wherewithal to bring to students the thinking processes to lift them up, to level the playing field. And what happens is that we focus, it seems, so much on teachers that we lose track of the students' thinking abilities and their abilities to be fluent with their ideas. So I believe that we have to change the whole idea of what the playing field is, that we really have to rethink our whole model about how we even facilitate thinking. Because I don't know about you, but in the United States, you may not believe this, but thinking actually became popular in about 1980. I mean, it's sort of funny to say that, especially knowing the United States. You wonder sometimes. But what's really important is that our history and the focus on thinking, and this conference, which started before the 1980s, has been primarily focused on teachers improving their abilities to work with students. So that's one of the shifts that I'd like to make. By the way, I do want to tell you that there's a little bit of nudity in this presentation. Is that okay? Okay, not me. Because I want to go back a little bit and provide some context and some history for this. So let me show you this. I promise nudity, okay? So we know a lot about cognitive skills development, child development, emotional, social, physical, cognitive, from a long time ago. This is actually my father in 1929. And he was put into, by his parents, the longest longitudinal study of human development ever done. And this was at UC Berkeley in California. Every month of his life, up until about 4 years old, he went in and they studied him physically, emotionally, cognitively. Back then it was IQ testing, correct? And they began to really look at how he was thinking. And they would give him activities, and they would begin to describe these activities. such as, here's at 5 months old, he picks up block, pushes himself up strongly, begins to play with paper. This is 5 months old, right? 5 months old. He smiles at himself in the mirror. I guess that's what a selfie is, right? You know. He reaches, listen to the, and if you remember what Art Costa was talking about this morning, he reaches persistently for toys out of reach. And by visit 6, he picks up blocks deftly, I like that, and directly. So here we know, and now we know about the human brain and the human mind, that there's great plasticity. So here is a 5-month-old that is already exploring the world through inquiry, through investigation, through thinking, correct? So by the way, just to let you know that I was put into the same study when I was born. So I'm actually, I know it's scary. I know, it's very scary. But that's actually one of the reasons that I'm so intrigued by the idea of how do we directly facilitate student thinking. Because I remember when I was 4 or 5 years old, there was a researcher who would give me problems to solve, whether it was stacking blocks or a lot of IQ kind of problem-solving questions. And the researcher would give me the problem, and I would try to solve it, and then I would say to the researcher, did I get it right? And what would the researcher say? Tell me about how you're thinking. Tell me about how you are thinking. I am not going to mediate your thinking right now. I just want you to become reflective on your own thinking. So, but then I would go into my classroom, my normal classroom, and what did I get? Oh, you got that wrong. Here's the answer, right? And sometimes some very high quality teaching where I was asked to solve problems, but it was always the teacher guiding me to how to solve the problem. Even though it was quite facilitative, it was always the teacher. I never felt like I had the tools to really do the problem solving on my own because I was always guided. Our curriculum design, mostly around the world, might be very strong in content, and it might even be directed toward the development of thinking, but most of it is teacher-centered. If you would, just take a moment and check with your partner right now. Does this make sense so far, what I'm saying, or what are the ideas that come up for you from what I just offered? So take a moment. All right, let's come back together in a moment. So, here are my kids, my students, the last day that I was a teacher in a classroom in 1982. And I was piloting, and this is really a lot of what I'm talking about today and sharing with you. I see sort of the starting point for these ideas of student-centered models is that I was piloting a program called Think, 1982. That was too long ago, right? What it was about was directly defining for students fundamental cognitive processes, or what some people call thinking skills, and at the same time developing literacy skills and language development and mathematics integrated together. So there are a lot of people that are focused on developing curricula using thinking processes. There are folks that are looking at how to develop teachers' abilities to improve pedagogy for thinking. But how is it that you can directly go to students, train them in a sense, or teach them some fundamental cognitive processes so that they are the ones that are driving the questioning and thinking in the classroom with teachers as a backdrop? So, but now, fast forward from 1982 to now, we have very different students around the world. The president of Google basically said within the next 10, 15 years, I think he said 2025, everybody in the world will have a handheld device. Everybody. Right now, we're working in Ethiopia with 36 public schools in Tigray in the north of Ethiopia. What do people have to communicate? Handheld devices. So what we have is a situation where it isn't just a matter of can you cover the content, can you deliver the curriculum, can you be a better teacher in order to improve thinking. It's now even more important that we engage students in having the tools very fluently, and I like the word automaticity that you used. The idea is that they can automatically and thoughtfully engage with all the content that they're faced with. Isn't that a problem? I mean, I remember my son having these, on the computer, downloading things. Did he know what he was looking at? Does he still now know what he's looking at? So it's a matter of engaging at that level. So the research also shows, and I'm going to move a little bit more quickly now and get into some of these models to get very practical. But if you know John Hattie's work out of New Zealand, he did a meta-analysis of teaching and learning, and 3 of the top indicators of successful schools are these. 1, teachers engaging students, engaging them through their thinking and the content. The second was developing, and I like this, developing in students a way of thinking so that they feel that they are empowered and have the tools to think for themselves. And it's very conscious. So we're not saying that everybody thinks alike, but that we want to facilitate the thinking so students have an array of tools to draw from, and they become aware of their own style of thinking. And then the third is really looking at problem solving or inquiry. So how do we engage students cognitively? How do we help them identify, and here's where the dispositions come in, and habits of mind. How do we really help them to understand how they think and their style of thinking? And then can they apply that to problem solving? So I think this research is very helpful, and it really synthesizes much of what we know from cognitive science research and learning theory from a long time ago. So I'm going to pass through a few of these slides. By the way, tomorrow our group called Thinking Schools International has a whole theoretical model and principles and things like that. And I'm going to be presenting this tomorrow. This is, if you want to take a picture of it, you can go now or you can see this later. But the student-centered models really come out of a broad spectrum of research in the areas of creativity and dispositions and inquiry and learning styles, and also, of course, cognition. So what I want to say is that we didn't just sort of invent these student-centered models out of thin air. They really come out of these broad principles. And these are these 5 areas that we draw from. So I'm going to move a little more quickly. this is really key. What our group has come together after working in schools for the last 7 or 8 years, and we said, what are the most important values or principles that we believe guide the schools that we've been working with? One is what many people here have been talking about at this conference, is that, that we've broken the myth, and Howard Gardner really did that with multiple intelligences, that all learners have the capacity to improve their thinking abilities, that it's not static. So that's been talked about quite a bit at this conference. That is a breakthrough. It's still in the residue, it's still within the mindset of a lot of leaders in the field that decide we should have this kind of curriculum and not really focus on thinking. A second principle that is really key that I'm going to focus on right now in another minute is this idea of student-centered models. And I'm going to go into this in a minute. If you look at a lot of the work on 21st century learning and the skills, what you get are these long lists of skills that students should be able to use. Is that student-centered? It's teacher-centered and it's adult-centered. It's saying, here are all these skills that all the students, if you handed that to a student and said, okay, you need to learn all these skills, I'm going to help you, what would they say? It's just, way too much. So it's the idea of how do we consolidate and synthesize what we know into models that students can learn. And then third, this is really key, is engaging students in directly applying these models to the content learning that they're doing and to their own lives. Okay? Take a moment at your pair, because I've been talking quite a bit now. Take a moment and think about and talk about these 3 principles. Do these make sense to you? Or if they don't, what doesn't quite make sense? So take another moment, if you would. All righty, let's come back together. Great. Good. So let's jump into student-centered models. I just wanted to set up some of the context here because the term student-centered is used so often. In the United States, I often hear educators say, it's all about the student. Well, what does that mean when we're calling out this idea of student-centered models? We know as educators in our heart, it's all about focusing on the students, but we get carried away by curriculum and assessments and the very complex task we have in the culture of a school that we have to remember is nested within a community, within a country, within the global environment. But it seems like we sort of let go of really going to the students with the thinking processes. So let's look at this. This idea of student-centered models really means that we're working with processes, and Art Costa said this morning, that are already within the students. Just consider how hard it would be to actually teach students to think if they were a blank slate. Not possible, right? It's impossible. So the idea is, from the neuroscience research and what we know just almost as a matter of fact now, is that every child is born to think and has the capacities to think. So what we're doing is engaging that, and that's key to this idea of student-centered learning. But most of our students are like this when they hit problems. I've been in groups, like this size, a little bit larger, of principals and head teachers at secondary schools. And I'll ask the question of you as well. If you ask a secondary student that's graduated from high school, or maybe even a college student, if you ask the question, what are your fundamental thinking processes? What do you think they would say? What? What kind of a question is that, right? Or what are, when you're problem solving, what are the most important habits of mind, or how do you solve a problem? They go, and I mean, this is what people tell me, is that actually students exit secondary school and even colleges, they know how to think in a way, but they haven't really gotten to that level of becoming fluent and really explicitly understanding how they're thinking. They haven't become metacognitive. They've done all the cognition, right? We've given them very rich projects, they engage in that, but then, in fact, they haven't been able to step back and look at how they think, okay? So that's really key, I think, to our work. So, there are, 5 or 6, you can add to this. This is a consolidation of what we think a pretty good definition of a student-centered model is, and then I'll show you a few of them. We believe that, first off, a student-centered model needs to be fundamental. It can't be esoteric, it can't be highly theoretical, it can't be so involved that a student can't learn it. We also believe that the pieces of the model need to work together. They need to be integrated so that the student can use them. So go back to my son with the knife set. When he pulled out that knife set, he could do anything with those knives together. They all worked together, right? So they were integrated together, and they were fundamental. Developmental, that a student-centered model needs to be able to go from very simple to complex tasks. Let's go back to my son again. He started very simply with the tools. Actually, he cut off a little bit of his finger about 3 weeks ago. So it's still developmental, right? So the idea is that you can use these knives just as you can use thinking processes or inquiry processes, and they become ever more complex. You can make ever more elegant dishes or ideas. That the model needs to be intuitive. It has to make sense. I mean, if we're offering models to students and they're going, I don't know, this doesn't really make sense, they're not going to hold on to it. They're not going to really learn it. They're not going to really be able to apply the tools. It needs to be teachable. And that's one of the things that we work with very closely with schools, is working with teachers so they're able to apply the models and directly teach students how to use these models for thinking. And then finally, they need to be transferable. If these models are somehow abstract or they don't really connect to learning content or improving thinking, then we've lost the whole reach of the whole thinking process movement. In the 1980s, there were a lot of programs, at least in the United States, that there were separate programs for thinking. It's like on Tuesday afternoon, we're doing a thinking program. And on Wednesday, we're doing the regular content. So here we have to really ensure that students are able to transfer these different models across disciplines. Take a moment in your pairs. What do you think about this? Does this make sense? Remember when I asked you at the beginning, what do you think a student-centered model is? Take this as a mirror and talk about some of the things you might have said. Or what would you add to this? So if you would, take another moment. Alrighty, here we go. So let me introduce three models to you. And the first one, I'm gonna go through a couple of slides quickly. The three models are, one is thinking points, and these are, you'll see, based on fundamental cognitive processes. Open minds, which really derives from habits of mind and the dispositions that Art was describing this morning, and a reflective action process that is really about students becoming really high quality questioners and problem solvers. Let me just go through this. By the way, I developed this model, thinking maps, back in 1986. So this was some of my original work that I'm slowly letting go of. You know something you really like that you created, and you sort of say, okay, it's time to let it go. So I've let it go a little bit because I realized that it doesn't fully fit what I think is this idea of student-centered models. By the way, there are some fundamental cognitive processes laid out here. Defining in context, describing, comparing and contrasting, classifying, whole part, spatial relationships, sequencing, cause and effect reasoning, and seeing analogies. By the way, Piaget identified these as mental operations and fundamental. So let me introduce you to a new model. But to do this, I need you to stand up. Okay? I know, it's late in the afternoon. Here. So hard. Okay. So you might want to put down your pads, iPads, paper pads. Okay? So, here's the thinking points. First off, one of the things about the thinking points is that we can introduce them relatively quickly to students, but they're based on deep fundamental thinking processes. So the first one is thinking points, and just sort of go like this, okay? So this is right up here with viewpoints. Don't poke anybody, please, all right? Okay, so these are all your ideas about anything that you're thinking about. So this is viewpoints, right? Viewpoints. Okay? Now, what I'd like you to do is just go like this. And these are character points. What are the characteristics of something that you're looking at? Okay? Here's what I want you to do now is connect up with somebody, and now you're comparing characteristics of things. Okay? I think we're all connected as human beings, right? Okay? Okay, so now we have we have all our ideas, we have characteristics. Okay, now think about how important this is. In mathematics, we call them, at least in the States, attributes. In the sciences, we call them properties. When we're studying literature, we might call them character traits. So these are deep, fundamental thinking processes that I want every child in the world to at least have the vocabulary. Forget about whether it's visual or not, to have the cognitive vocabulary. Okay, so here is group points. So if you could, you're supposed to follow me. Okay, it's like this, group points. So these are categories, and they can come from the ground up, inductively, or from the top down. All right? Oh, you want to go the other way? Okay, you can go both ways. No, there we go. So this is basically spatial reasoning. It comes out of anatomy. What are the physical part-whole relationships? Okay? You're very good. This is good. It's better than a cup of coffee in the afternoon. Okay, and then we have like this. Sequencing. Or change points. Anytime you do a sequence, you're changing. Okay? Now you can also make this more complex by having causes that bring about a change. Stop there. You're having too much fun. Sorry. Okay. So over here, so you have causes that lead to effects in the long term. Now this is really going to push it, that lead to feedback loops in a system, right? Because aren't we trying to teach systems to kids? Solar systems, body systems, political systems, eco or ecosystems. So when students understand that they can sequence, stay with me, these change points, they can also start with causes and effects. They also see that they're all related together and connect back. And you are being videotaped. I want you to know that you're all being videotaped. Okay. Okay. So, I only have a few minutes more, but I wanted to make sure we got that in at least. Here's the issue. So, how difficult, this is a rhetorical question, how difficult would that be to teach to a 5-year-old? Not difficult at all. How about a 10-year-old? How about an adult? How long did it take you? Okay, maybe you're not perfectly fluent, but are you already fluent with the cognitive processes? You do those every day. It's embedded in the content, right? We were talking about that. Those processes are really like the anatomy of our content. Content hangs on these processes. So once we identify for students that there are these fundamental cognitive processes and we have a visual tool connected to it, they can then collaborate, they can go into any content, and the teacher has a language for thinking in the classroom that is both, well, 3. Verbal, right? Verbal. It's also visual, right? And it's also spatial. So kids are actually mapping their ideas, okay? So that's one of the student-centered languages that we use. And our work is whole school. So wouldn't a whole learning community become that much more effective? Individuals, pairs, cooperative groups, the whole school working together, and they have a common language. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? They can also get very complex. Remember I was saying any model that is student-centered can't have a dead end to it. So notice, taking a simple topic such as an apple, you can use all of these thinking points together and see that knowledge and thinking processes are integrated together, which is really important. A lot of people use graphic organizers and they put information in different places and they don't connect them together, okay? So, I'm going to just close out by showing you the other two models. And I just want to really be fair about the time for the next presenters, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly, if I can. Here's Art Costa and Benicallic's dispositions, habits of mind. A list of 16 dispositions. This is not an Art, I've talked to Art about this, it's not a model per se, it's a listing of really...
Buenas tardes. La conferencia Teoría Ejecutiva de la Inteligencia, la acción, último objetivo educativo de José Antonio Marina se traslada al auditorio a las 5 de la tarde. Gracias.
I don't want a translation. So it sounds like I'm finishing up here. This is a list of habits of mind. What we did is said, if we were to consolidate and say, what do we believe are the most important dispositions, we came up with 5.
Buenas tardes. La conferencia del pensamiento crítico.
What are they saying? Do I have to leave?
De Rafi Feuerstein se celebrará en la sala A3.
Okay. By the way, I think Rafi Feuerstein was just referenced. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah? Okay, so one of the things about Reuven Feuerstein's work is he was focused on how do you mediate thinking, the teacher mediating the student thinking, correct? Cognitive mediation. So you can use these same tools for cognitive mediation, but what if the students, this is what, when I came to really look at Reuven Feuerstein's work, what if the students were also fluent with the same processes? Then they'd mediate each other's thinking, and they would become more metacognitive. They'd mediate their own thinking, which is what Reuven Feuerstein really was focused on. So, students learn this basic model, be reflective, connective, the empathy, flexible, precise, and persistent. And then the other dispositions are background to these, and they're learned within a school. But the students have these 5 fundamental habits of mind to begin with. Let me go to one more. You know Bloom's taxonomy, right? Is that a student model, student-centered model, or a teacher-centered model? It's a teacher-centered model, right? What happens if we took Bloom and said, we really want to focus on problem solving for students? We came up with a questioning for inquiry model. And by the way, this is really not so much different than a scientific process or many other inquiry models. I don't think this is something brand new, but it's basically saying to students, anytime you're having to solve a problem, here are these 5 phases of problem solving, okay? So, the idea is, here are these 3 models that have really led to these kinds of outcomes in the schools that we've been working with. That self-esteem and confidence rises. This comes out of Exeter University's view of our work in about 60 schools in the UK. So once students have these models, they become self-confident. They say, I can do this. I know I have the tools to do it. They become more independent. The study showed that all the schools of the 60 raised achievement. That means that they were applying it to content. There's deeper understanding. This was reported by the teachers in these schools, that students didn't have just a shallow understanding of concepts, but they were getting deeper into their understanding because they were thinking about how they were thinking through that content. Improved questioning. So the inquiry model that we've been using focuses on students asking the questions as much as the teachers asking the questions. And then skills for lifelong learning. This is one of the things the teachers identified, is that the students, they could see that the students would be able to use these over their lifetime. So let me bring this back together. Take a moment with your partner. What have you, in this short period of time, what have you thought about with student-centered models? Am I saying something that is sort of already out there, or is there something different here about making that shift? So take a moment with your pair and reflect, and then we'll call it the day. Take another moment, please. Let me just bring this to a close, and then maybe we have a moment for questions. Thank you. I think the whole area of research on change in schools, some of it's very old, but some of it I think we need to return to. What is the kind of change that we're actually trying to make in schools? Because our organization works with whole schools only. That is the, if you will, the unit of change. It's not the individual teacher, it's not the whole system, it's school by school. And first order change has been primarily what schools have been about, reinforcing what's happening, getting some improvement. Second order change is really about changing practices, and many of you will go away from this conference and already have, and go back to the school and say, hey, we can make some change here. We can really focus on thinking. I think that what we're really going for here at this time in the evolution of human beings and our Earth right now is engaging all the members in transforming their whole school. And that means coming together as a whole school and saying, really, this is about student-centered thinking. So thank you very much. Nick, you can... So we have time for some questions, and I'm available here. My colleague Esther Lopez, we're hanging out in the exhibit area a little bit, so you can contact us. So if there are any questions or comments, I don't need to put this on, I don't think. Any questions? I think it is time for a siesta. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.